There is a danger when you use the explanation as an excuse. And there's also a danger that once you start doing that, you start to gaslight yourself. Like, maybe it's okay because they do have a fragile ego. Doesn't matter. It's not okay. The reason I want people to understand this explanation excuse issue is so they can set themselves free. How many of you know somebody as an adult person who's narcissistic, but you know their backstory and you know that as a child, they were super valued for this thing they did. They were a great soccer player, or they were a great spelling bee person, or they were a ballerina or something, and that's what they were valued for. They were a performer, or almost like a performing pony, and the parents was really kind of only liked them because they did that. And you can see in their adult narcissism, you can see that the reason a lot of that came from this parent who really only loved them conditionally. Drop it in the comments if you did, because that's what this video is about. This is a new series we're doing on how we manage the origins of a person's narcissism in our life, right? The origins of what they've been through. Their behavior is bad now, but how knowing their backstory affects how we make justifications, how we interact with them, and even sometimes how we blame ourselves. So in this video, we're taking on when you're in a relationship with somebody who has this kind of performing pony backstory to their narcissism. And before I get to that, I am Dr. Ramani. This is a YouTube channel on narcissism and toxic relationships and difficult situations in general. It's my hope that what you learn on this channel will help you better cope with these relationships so you can heal and ideally avoid them in the first place. If you're new to this channel, please join us by subscribing. If you happen to like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't want to, that's okay too. Thank you again for that, though. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this performing pony narcissism and what it does to us. So again, in this series, the hope is that one of our big struggles is justification in these relationships, right? We justify. And part of those justifications come from knowing a narcissistic person's backstory. This kind of narcissism, the sort of performing pony backstory, is a tough one, right? So, like I said, you may know a narcissistic person who in childhood was valued for putting on a show. Maybe they were the pageant kid, or the soccer star, or the spelling bee champ, or the chess whiz, or the child actor, or the virtuoso musician. Now, please keep in mind, not all, in fact, I'd say most children who go deep into these really publicly performative spaces as children, most of them don't turn out to be narcissistic adults. Many kids in these spaces actually felt very supported in what they were doing. They wanted to do it. They felt that their parents had good boundaries, and they knew that they were loved, whether they did it or not, or whether they won or lost, whether they got the part or not, and that these activities were an important and healthy part of their childhood. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about that healthy version. This is about the children who were loved largely because they performed and made their parents look good. When you think about it, it's really quite sad that these are children who knew that the only way that they were going to get this much time with the parent or love or regard from the parent was because they did the thing and excelled at the thing that the parent wanted them to do. The parents got validation from their child's performances and successes and would yammer on and on and on about their children and basically turn their child into their entire social and validation universe. The child's performance became a source of narcissistic supply, and so were all the trappings around it. And the parent would often sit there and drink in the adulation of their child or their children's success, but however would also potentially be quite cruel if the child did not perform or win the way they wanted. You need only sit on the sidelines of a high-end child's sports match to see these performing pony-type parents pressuring and shaming their children. And I know when I witnessed this when I had younger children, I would just want to go up to these people and tell them to please stop and find their own damn lives and stop getting identity from their children and just love their kids. But I didn't do that, partly because I'm afraid of conflict, but partly because my child would have actually been furious if I embarrassed her that way. So let's say you know that this is the backstory, this performing pony thing is the backstory about the narcissistic person in your life. That they had, really, they lived that ultimate experience in conditional love. That if you get on the top team, we love you. If you win the pageant, we love you. If you get the big spelling bee trophy, we love you. If you don't, well, we're not feeling you so much. And while they may pay lip service to, yeah, of course I love you still, the parents' disappointment would be written all over the face. The parents might even withdraw at those times. Now, narcissistic people who have this performing pony backstory are very concerned as adults by success and appearances. The vast majority of people raised this way who don't want to do the thing or be the thing that the parent expects of them may also do other things, including rebel or keep doing the activity despite the toll it is taking on them, or do it but not be good enough. And they don't become narcissistic. They may have very difficult relationships with those demanding and conditional parents, but they may be quite anxious and still feel they have to earn love, but they don't become narcissistic. In some cases, children with these kinds of parents may feel guilty that their parent did put so much time in or money in or did so much, and they may either end up sort of being disgusted with the parent, but they also have a lot of self-blame and view themselves as a bad person for viewing their parents through that lens. But for the narcissistic folks who do have this sort of performing pony origin to their narcissism, these are often folks who end up being grandiose or communal narcissistic adults. The narcissistic people who have this performing pony backstory had parents who actually were very involved, I would say even too involved, which is why we don't tend to see as much of the malignant and vulnerable narcissists here. It's not that backstory of neglect we tend to see with those types of narcissism. To the world, these are children who look like they had deeply involved parents who were around all the time and probably even too much, and were intrusive and didn't allow their children to individuate and develop their own interests, or even let them deviate from this activity that was so important to the parent. But these parents derive their identity from their child. And the children who evolve into narcissistic personalities from this backstory often do not get to develop an ego that is connected to anything but their performative self. They don't get to develop as a person with feelings and subjective experiences. Their identity is as a soccer star, a baseball star, a ballerina. The idea of them as an individual person with feelings and other experiences was secondary to that identity. And that is often the curse of narcissism, that these are people that are defined by a superficial identity rather than as a fully formed person with an emotional core. One of the core deficits of narcissism is that the narcissistic person's identities are determined by what they believe other people want of them, by what will get them validation. They set goals from a place of grandiosity, what looks good rather than what they want, because they don't know what they want. That doesn't get shaped, especially with this performing pony story. People with this kind of origin of narcissism, like I said, are about appearances, are often one-trick ponies, pun intended. They'll talk about their childhood or adolescent achievements, even if they're out of date. There's, again, a lot of superficiality, a lot of achievement orientation, and often run the risk of doing the same thing to their own children because they may not connect the dots on what all of this conditional performance, way they were raised, what it did to them. So if you are in a relationship with someone who has this performing pony backstory, it can be frustrating and vapid and exhausting. You may feel that it is always them who's doing the show, and you always have to clap as though they were a 6-year-old cartwheeling through the living room. Their chronic need for attention and validation will also be taxing. As with all of these origin stories, knowing where it comes from can play on the trauma bond and also lead to justification. And you can fall into the pattern of cutting them slack because you feel bad for the conditional parental love that they came from. In a way, this kind of relationship, if you're with somebody who has this backstory, can feel like you're indulging a child. If you're co-parenting with someone with this backstory, they may get caught up in the same intergenerational cycle of pushing this child and defining your child together by whatever activity that they want them to do. And you may need to step in and advocate for your children. Now, if you had a parent like this who tried to do this to you, they may very well have tried to pull this entire performing pony cycle on you. And if you resisted, you would feel the harsh sting of them dissing you for not wanting to do or excel at whatever thing they wanted you to do. Most children want time with their parents or their parents' approval and may really knock themselves out to excel at what the parent wants them to excel at. And this can be quite painful if you don't quite have an affinity for that activity or an interest in it. And having a parent with this kind of backstory, so it happened to your own parent, can be very painful if you don't perform the way you want to. In fact, the golden child scapegoat dynamic in a situation like this may emanate from the golden child being good at what the performing pony narcissistic parent wants, and the scapegoat not being able to do that. So that can actually create that dynamic within a family. If you have someone in your life with this backstory, they may very well view relationships as transactional. Well, if I do this thing, then I will succeed, and I may expect this of others, which feels awful if you aren't interested in hoop jumping as a form of love. So if you do, again, have someone in your life that has this sort of, again, performing pony backstory, what I'm calling it, you can call it sort of this very performative, conditional kind of place that they came from. The key is to understand, yeah, you get where it came from, but if you really do feel that your relationship is transactional or that there's a conditionality that you have to hoop jump to keep their love and that they insist on hoop jumping in all relationships, and for them it really is that as long as they're performing, then they can get away with other behaviors, which is often what their parents did to them. It can be very, very confusing because, like I said, you might say, oh, they're just repeating what they saw in childhood, and that's true. That's actually not unusual in narcissistic personalities. The question is whether you want to sit there for years or even decades waiting for them to work it through, which is going to be real hard to do if they're not in therapy. So while these relationships may be entertaining for a minute because they're always showing off that thing they can do, after a while you might find yourself getting bored and frustrated and having none of your needs met at all in this relationship. Have any of you ever been in a narcissistic relationship with somebody where you know that probably the reason that they're narcissistic is because they were a spoiled brat as a child? Their parents gave them everything and anything. They never heard the word no. And now you can see why they're like this as an adult. And knowing that, how did that affect how you thought about them and their narcissism? Did it lead you to make excuses or say, oh gosh, I'm not going to be one more person who spoils you? Let's take that on. I'm Dr. Ramani, and welcome to this YouTube channel where we take on these kinds of questions about narcissism. In this particular series, we're looking at sort of some of the origins of narcissism, where the backstories of these patterns. But instead of just focusing on that, how you take your knowledge of what that backstory is, like, I see why they're narcissistic, this or that happened to them. How does that really affect the kinds of justifications you make for this relationship? So let's take this on. The tricky thing about narcissism is that there's no one clear path, that this is how it happens, and people aren't really born this way. But we do know that some people become narcissistic because in essence, really, they were just simply spoiled brats as kids. So if I can give you just one simple piece of evidence, really do not get into a relationship with someone who is a really spoiled child. Because even if they are not narcissistic as adults, it may not be worth the headache. Because in this essence, you're going to end up spending the rest of your life cleaning up after them. Now, some folks become narcissistic because they were spoiled. But not just spoiled. They were spoiled and their emotional needs were not met. So in essence, they were overindulged sort of with material things, toys, experiences. They didn't have to clean their room. They could buy everything in the gift store. The parent would let the kid do whatever they wanted. They just basically never heard no. But simultaneously, they'd be underindulged emotionally. They might get a sports car for their 16th birthday, but if they had a real emotional want or need or hurt, their parent would be completely disinterested, probably looking for a way to buy themselves out of the situation, or may even shame their child for having those emotions. Now, just spoiling a kid is not enough to make them narcissistic. If the parent is actually really present and mirroring and emotionally available and consistent, and also spoils the child, it's not a likely combination, but it's possible. It's definitely far less likely to see that spoiled child careening into narcissism. What is more likely is what we see as a combination of that difficult temperament, plus that being spoiled, plus having an inconsistent or unavailable caregiver. That all adds up to that overindulged, spoiled path to narcissism. Now, what does that mean in adulthood? It can be hard, for example, for people like this to hold jobs because the first time they're held accountable or they don't want to follow the rules, they may lose the job because they're so accustomed to getting their way and not having to follow rules. People with these spoiled backstories may be undisciplined with money because they're just so used to getting what they want when they want and assuming it'll always all work out. They may also maintain an ongoing financial dependence on their parents who spoiled them initially and are still available to just keep bailing them out and buying them what they want. Narcissistic people with the overindulged backstory, that spoiled backstory, may get really easily dysregulated when they're frustrated or disappointed because back in the day, they just always got what they wanted. Think of like Veruca Salt in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Another thing to remember about people who have this sort of spoiled child, overindulged origin to their narcissism, another thing they often don't ever learn is how to soothe themselves. Because they always get their way, they never have to sit with the disappointment. So they don't have to sit with that uncomfortable feeling and learn to do something with it. What that means is as they go into adulthood, they don't have what we call that internal self-soothing mechanism, a way to sort of calm themselves down when they get worked up. As a spoiled child, when they got worked up, either someone would buy them off or let them have their crazed tantrum. As adults, they don't have that internal mechanism to sort of soothe themselves. And so as an adult, you'll see them often get really bent out of shape and really escalate quickly when they don't get their way. So what does that mean for an adult relationship? It means living with the equivalent of a spoiled child who will always put their material needs ahead of everyone else's. Sorry, couldn't pay the bills this month, but look at this cool new skateboard I bought. This kind of spoiled person may expect you to keep spoiling them in adulthood and have a sort of stunted sense of irresponsibility. You may feel like you're constantly cleaning up after an insolent teenager. When we think of the impact of this kind of a origin story on you, I gotta tell you, this story doesn't typically bring up much empathy from adults in relationships with people like this. Now, it's one thing when we learn about someone's history of trauma or difficulties with attachment. Those stories are difficult to hear about, and people might fall into a justification loop if you hear someone had a tough start. But with these overindulged spoiled brat stories, lots of people may say, yikes, when I finally met their family, I got it. And so when they'll see they go home and they're waited on by enabling parents and they get away with everything. And you can say, now I see why they expect me to be their personal assistant, their house cleaner, their butler, and the adult in the relationship. And you may be less likely to feel so bad for them or to justify their behavior. Some folks may get too deep into the relationship to get out. They have children or marriage or they live together, and they have the harsh reckoning that this spoiled child narcissism is now spoiled adult narcissism. But people may be less likely to say, oh, I feel so bad that they were spoiled as kids, but rather would say, why didn't I see this sooner? And sometimes they'll feel some disgust at this whole dynamic of this spoiled child being a spoiled adult. There isn't much hope for change here. People with these backstories may not be mobilized to change, and perhaps the only catalyst for change is if things in their life really go south for them and they lose their jobs, money, and really can't create the life they want. But their entitlement means that they will feel owed that life and may simply just descend deeper and deeper into chronic rage at not getting their way. And you may less likely to justify their behavior if you know that it's simply them being a spoiled child, which is a lot of their origin of it. But knowing this backstory, if you can, it can be a real wake-up call that there's probably not much you can do to turn this relationship around. If you set boundaries, they'll push back. If you try to communicate, they won't listen. But with this as the story about why they're narcissistic, it might leave you feeling a little less guilty, which may mean you are more willing to walk away. The continuum of these backstories, some of which are really difficult, again, like things like trauma and neglect, but this one, where the spoiled child, often the golden child, gets away with so much, gets whatever they want, and turns into sort of a wretched adult. Like I said, typically grandiose narcissistic folks. But other than a handful of people say, well, it wasn't their fault, they were spoiled. Most people will say, it doesn't seem like you had such a hard childhood if you were being taken to Disneyland all the time and got every toy you wanted. And in this way, people who are with these spoiled child narcissists, if they can detect it early enough, may be less likely to justify and more likely to save themselves from having to clean up behind this narcissist for the rest of their lives. Thanks again. So let's take on this question. What do I mean that when it comes to narcissism, that explanations are not excuses? As human beings, we always want to know why. Children ask that, why? Why, Mom? Why? Getting the answer to why is comforting. If we know why someone's crying, we understand it. Maybe we can help them. If we know why someone ended a relationship, we may not like it, but we can get our heads around it. If we know why good people have bad things happen to them, it helps, give us a sense of faith and make sense of things. In fact, Viktor Frankl, the famous existential psychiatrist, writes that those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Now that doesn't necessarily get at the reason for something, but why is such an important question. Why is what drives science and religion and of course psychology. I teach my undergraduates that one of the main goals of psychology is to explain human behavior. We're not always very good at it, especially when it comes to mental illness, but the why is why. Why is a person depressed? Why is a person anxious? Why is a person narcissistic? Now, this entire YouTube channel in many ways is devoted to the why of narcissism. Why do people who are narcissistic behave the way they do? Why do we respond the way we do? Why do we fall for their toxic behavior? Why do we stay in these relationships? Why are they so mean afterwards? But here's where it gets tricky. And in fact, for many people who get stuck in these relationships or keep playing out the cycles of idealization, devalue, discard, and hoovering, knowing the why of narcissism can end up becoming a bit messy because it can end up becoming an excuse. This has actually come up for me recently. I've been spending weeks writing a lecture on domestic violence and narcissism for a conference. There was some concern, and this has been a long-standing concern in the domestic violence world, is that if we frame relationship violence or gender-based violence from a narcissism lens, then there's a risk that we may in some ways almost excuse it or not view it as awful as it is because we're writing it off as due to mental illness. First of all, narcissism is not a diagnosis, nor is it a mental illness. Narcissistic personality disorder is, but in most people out there who you meet who are narcissistic, they don't have narcissistic personality disorder, and the word narcissistic is not a diagnostic term. But the bigger concern is that if we were to subsume domestic abuse or relationship violence under a pattern of narcissism, that we run the risk of excusing the behavior. Like we can address narcissism and that will change it, instead of saying this is just not okay. So let's use the domestic violence example for a minute. If someone is beating someone up or psychologically abusing a partner, and we frame it through a lens of narcissism and all that goes along with the fragile ego that is threatened by whatever it's threatened by, and so they lash out with aggression and rage to protect the ego, etc., we may be able to explain the personality style, narcissism, and the attendant violence that happens in the relationship through that lens. So then there's the risk of, oh, so that's why they're doing it. So maybe We can work on the narcissism with them and they will stop being violent. No, 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 no. Abuse is unacceptable. Violence is unacceptable. I don't care the reason they had for beating up a partner. I don't care if it was narcissism. I don't care if it was intoxication. I don't care if it was PTSD. I don't care if it's just that they ate some bad seafood. Don't care. It's unacceptable. And ideally, the relationship is done. If the abuser wants to go get help, they can go do it on their own time and on their own dime. So when it comes to narcissism, using that framework above and beyond domestic abuse and violence, explaining why narcissists do what they do can get tricky. Some people want to know why people become narcissistic, why narcissistic people lack empathy, why narcissistic people are mean to them, why they gaslight. And honestly, all of those things can pretty reasonably be explained. But then the issue becomes, what are you supposed to do with those explanations? An explanation is not an excuse. Just because you know that their difficult backstory, maybe of their own abuse, may be what contributed to this fragile core sense of self and their defensive, aggressive posturing, or their difficult father and difficult grandmother may have contributed to an intergenerational cycle, it doesn't excuse their behavior. Or perhaps they're very sensitive to criticism and that day they got laid off. That explains it. Why their shame got triggered, it doesn't excuse it. The challenge is that many people take the explanations for where narcissistic patterns come from and how they get triggered and turn them into an excuse for bad behavior. In essence, just further enabling and emboldening the narcissist who doesn't really care about the harm that they're causing other than the shame it may evoke from them, which then leads to more bad behavior. You simply can't win when you're dealing with narcissistic and other high conflict personalities. Cognitive dissonance also plays a role here. Basically, when you have an explanation for why the narcissist is doing what they're doing, you're more likely to make a rationalization or justification for their behavior. Oh, they're yelling because their fragile ego was revealed to the world and they were shamed. So they just had to lash out to protect themselves. It's okay. Let's just put up with it. No. There is a danger when you use the explanation as an excuse. And there's also a danger that once you start doing that, you start to gaslight yourself, like, maybe it's okay because they do have a fragile ego. Doesn't matter. It's not okay. The reason I want people to understand this explanation excuse issue is so they can set themselves free. And I also want people to understand narcissism so they can set themselves free. May not necessarily leave the relationship. I know that leaving parents or adult children is overwhelming. I know that leaving marriages is complicated because of custody issues. But stop blaming yourself. No, there is not another way you could have said it to a narcissist so you could get a better response for them. There's not a better way to respond to a narcissist so they don't get mad. And no, you don't need to be more or better to get it right. Their impulsive reactions, their fragility, their reactivity, their lack of self-reflective capacity, that's on them. And if they choose not to do the work on themselves, it definitely will never change. And even if they do, it may not. The explanation then needs to become one more tool you can use to protect yourself, to fortify your own sanity, to not personalize it, to disengage a bit, and yes, in some cases, to leave. It can fortify your radical acceptance to know that this is not going to change, and this is it, whether you stay or go. But the explanations should not be a bridge to making excuses. Their backstory is not your problem. You didn't abuse them, and you aren't their therapist, so you can't be the one to set them straight. Standing around and being abused in the name of another person's narcissism is not noble, and it's not martyr-like. It's dangerous, it's unhealthy, and it enables them further to keep treating other people badly. Explanations can also drive predictions about behavior. If we can understand narcissism and why it is what it is, we can understand anything, we might be able to predict it. For example, you know that a narcissist lacks empathy. We know why a narcissist lacks empathy. So you also know that if you share a heartfelt, emotional story with them, they may end up looking bored or disinterested. If you at this point don't get that, then that's on you. Because the explanations will tell you that. We know that that's how they're going to respond to that. And then if you excuse it when it happens, then you are not only ignoring that explanation, maybe you're just taking that explanation and turning it into an excuse. So even as you watch this YouTube channel, I do recognize that every case is a little different. And while these sweeping patterns I talk about are generally correct, yeah, there are some individual differences. While I give you these explanations, they're meant to be educational. They are not ever meant to serve as a tool to make an excuse for another person's behavior. And when you hear explanations, hear them with a very clear ear. Don't accept them as excuses, because if you do, you will just enter the whole cycle again. And how much of your life do you want to waste that way? If you're going to take the time to put the effort to learn these explanations for the why of it, then take that information, please, and let it be something that drives radical acceptance for you. Please don't let it be a place where you make excuses and say, they have a fragile ego, so maybe I should give them a chance. No. If somebody is treating you in a toxic, invalidating, and an abusive manner, maybe understanding it can help you say, okay, now I get it, but please commit to not excusing it. I hope this answers this question for you and gives you pause to think about, maybe I am using explanations as excuses, and that's how I keep getting stuck in this toxic cycle. Or that might be what blocks you from true radical acceptance. What is the line between empathy and justification? This line, this demarcation, is something that so many people who want to avoid or manage the narcissistic people in their lives struggle with. And definitely people who are in these relationships and getting out of them struggle with this as well. And even people who are trying to gatekeep and not get into these relationships. What is the line between empathy and justification? So let's try this out a few ways. Story number 1. You meet someone new. This new person you've just met is complaining about their unfair life, how difficult their life is, and a lot of it's true. And you offer them empathy. You say things like, that sounds really hard, I'm so sorry. They keep complaining. You even offer to pick up the check, even though you have your own money woes, since they are having such a hard time, and they respond with, well, thanks, I guess this is the one good thing that's going to happen to me today, but knowing my life, I better not get used to it. Now, you know they have been down on their luck. They just need to vent, but even as you get to know them, they never ask about you. But you tell yourself, they're going through so much, and maybe you're the one who's being selfish for thinking they should care about your life. Because, golly, this person is going through a lot, and why should they need to think about you? What's happening there? Empathy or justification? Let's take on another one. You work with someone. They keep putting more and more stuff at work on you. And they say things like, my kid is sick, then their car breaks down, then they say they're tired after their vacation, or they have a bad marriage, on and on, whatever their story is. You may not have those problems right now, and you recognize that their relationship problems and life problems are tough, and that they have just had a tough go of it balancing a long commute and children. More than once, you offer to stay late and take care of whatever had to get done at the workplace. This is happening more and more, and you tell them that you know how hard things are for them, and you say, what can I do to help? You yourself, though, you also have stuff on your plate, but not as much as them. That's what you tell yourself. So you keep doing it. You keep staying late. The one time, though, you're in a tough spot and you need someone to have your back at work, they say, that's your job. Why should I do it? And you don't push back on that. Empathy or justification? Just try another. You're in a long-term relationship with a narcissist, and the invalidation and all the rest of it are getting to you. But your partner just lost their job again for behaving like an ass again. It's been so many years, you've had kids, your kids are grown, but you feel bad because your partner's getting older and won't get a job that pays decently or is secure. And oh no, how are they going to land on their feet? And maybe you can just give it another chance. They are more angry than ever because of the job. And so the emotional abuse is at a high point. But you feel bad for them and don't want to have a deeper conversation with them. Empathy or justification? Let's try one more. Your elderly narcissistic parent has been terrible to you for your entire life and has burned most of the family bridges. So nobody is willing to step up, and your parent is getting older and sicker. Their apartment is looking like a hoarded mess, and something needs to be done. You want to just move them to an assisted living center. That's not bad, but that's in their town, but you feel bad about it. You think, well, I don't want to die alone like this either. Were they really that bad? You move out to where they live for a little while to help out, care for them, and extend yourself financially because you feel so bad for them. You feel sad for them being left alone there, but they refuse to be moved to be closer to your home, and they just expect you to help them where it works for them in their house, and they continue to verbally abuse you. What are we looking at here? Empathy or justification? So as you can see, there is a blurred space where the empathy hits the justification. And that right there, that spot, is the struggle of every narcissistic relationship. Empathy means being emotionally present, understanding the emotional experience of another person, being self-aware of what we say or do. So feeling bad about someone's difficult life and hearing their complaints, helping out the unfortunate coworker, feeling sad for what awaits the down and out narcissistic partner after many years, and the grief and solicitude about the elderly, abusive narcissistic parent, frankly, all of that is empathy. So what's the justification part? The new person you met complains and doesn't listen to you because they have a hard life and you just let it go. The coworker isn't addressing their structural issues in their life and instead making their problem your problem, and then they don't help you when they can and you let it go or write it off to them having a hard life. The long-term partner is raging at you just as they always have, and you let them off the hook because they're getting older and more unemployable. The elderly parent still feels entitled to what they want from you, and you feel guilty for not staying with them. The justification is the rationalizing of their bad behavior and making it your problem. Understanding the difficult circumstances and the challenges of that and mirroring them back to someone, empathy. Enduring their bad treatment and listening to the same complaints, not being seen or heard, working harder and it not being reciprocal, being verbally abused and extending yourself physically, emotionally, and financially for someone who has never been there and doesn't care that they are inconveniencing you, all of that is toxic justification. And it's in this blurred spot that most people who get sucked into and stuck in narcissistic relationships struggle with. If I feel bad for someone, shouldn't I do something? Up to a point, yeah. Sure, you can listen, but when it's the same complaining, aggrieved, refusing to take responsibility carousel, then at some point, it's about letting that person pull on their big kid pants, be an adult, take ownership of their lives, and manage it. Whether that means them going into therapy, getting a babysitter, moving. The justification empathy issue comes down to the core issue in narcissistic relationships. You have empathy for them. They have none for you. I'm the narcissist here. You can listen to me whine and complain. You can do my work for me. You can tolerate my emotional abuse because I'm a failure and can't keep a job. You can upend your life to take care of me because I planned badly. All of that is a manifestation of their lack of empathy towards you. When one person has empathy and the other does not, and you stick around in that situation, you do need to justify their behavior to stay in it. You keep saying things like, oh, they're going through a tough time, or they don't mean it, or they're old and alone, and it becomes bad for you. Empathy cannot be a one-way street. This is why disengagement and boundary setting and realistic expectations become so important. The complaining, not listening new person we talked about, well, those are low stakes when it's a new relationship. That person needs to get therapy, a life coach, and a grip. And that isn't yours to fix. The risks of getting stuck because you want to rescue that new person and feel that empathy is dangerous. That coworker needs to clean up their life. You aren't a social worker, and it does suck for them. You could even try to advocate for them, see if you can work with management on flex time or on-site childcare, remote work, but at the end of the day, that person needs to take responsibility. You can stop making excuses for them. Stop justifying. What about that long-term partner who is raging at you and can't hold a job? That's never going to change. You staying may lift the initial sense of guilt at either leaving or setting firm boundaries with someone who is basically an emotional toddler, but they could get themselves into therapy and at least make a good faith attempt at being better, but they won't. Maybe you can't even afford to leave because of their bad financial management, but at a minimum, see the situation clearly. That elderly parent, yes, maybe their mental faculties are slipping, but do you owe them something? I don't know that anyone owes anyone anything, but beyond that philosophical statement, if that parent is capable of moving and you want to stretch yourself to make their life possible by living near them, that's too big an ask if they could actually meet you where you're at. You have the ability to reject that or set up a hybrid you can live with without still being the 4-year-old child who is still trying to please this unpleasable parent who feels entitled to you sacrificing your life for them. And yes, you may need to withstand the disapproval of enabling family members who don't want this to be their problem. Laying down boundaries with narcissists is difficult because it is uncomfortable. And in some ways, capitulating and giving in and putting up with the narcissistic behavior is easier than the guilt and anxiety that come from saying no. When empathy hurdles into justification, that is when the relationship becomes bad for you. The ability to say, I do feel bad for them, but this isn't mine to fix, that's the key. Narcissistic abuse means your empathy comes up against a cruel adult's unwillingness to take responsibility and their vampire-like willingness to suck up your empathy, your rescue, and your rescuing. You are justifying the discomfort this relationship is causing on the basis of the victimized and sad backstories they give you. And there is no reciprocal support from them. You listen to them, they listen to you. That's not happening. When that happens, that's the day it veers into the lane of toxic justification. And that road can go for thousands of miles and a lifetime of being an emotional punching bag as well as a lifetime of regret. Stick with empathy and expect adults to be responsible for their own shit. Nobody's life is so bad that they can't do some of that. And if they can't, or they won't, more likely, don't justify. So hold on to that empathy. That empathy is a good space, something you don't want to lose. But what you don't want to do is springboard into the justifying. A lot of people confuse the two. Anytime you're signing off on their bad behavior, justification. Anytime you're saying, wow, that does seem really hard, that sounds really hard, empathy. Understand the difference so you don't get fully pulled under that bus. Thanks again.